Good day, and thank you for being with us today. Today we're going to be talking with Wolfgang Eichwede, who is responsible for the creation of the archive of the dissident movement and samizdat in Germany. On the one hand, this conversation is a continuation of the conversation we had with Cécile Vissier a year ago. She talked about France. Today we're going to be talking about Germany, about how in different European countries dissident studies came about, studies of the dissident movement in the Soviet Union. And today we are starting a cycle of 3 sessions about how this dissident movement was formed in Germany. We will meet again next time with Karl Eimermacher on June the 21st. On the 5th of July, we'll talk with Georg Witte. I'm going to let you know in great detail a bit later. I would like to immediately invite you to join in the conversation, raise your hands virtually. I'm going to try and build this conversation in the following way. We're going to talk not about Wolfgang himself, but about the context in which Wolfgang started to work and started creating this archive. So on the one hand, we're going to talk about the research of Wolfgang Eichwede, also about the attitude towards the USSR in Germany as it developed in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and about the creation of FSO, the Research Center for East European Studies. So thank you very much, Wolfgang, for agreeing to this conversation. I believe I will start from the very beginning. Could you tell us about your studies? What was the attitude towards the Soviet Union? What was the interest towards the literature, the new literature that emerged in the Soviet Union?
Я должен сказать, что я уже родился еще во время войны, поэтому...
I must say that I was born during the war. So in the 50s, I was a schoolboy. And in the 60s, I was a student at the University in Tübingen. I was interested in studying the Soviet Union, and this interest was sparked in me in the 1950s. On the one hand, it was still the time of the Cold War. And in Germany, the Soviet Union was viewed through the prism of totalitarianism. But at the same time, Nikita Khrushchev was calling for de-Stalinization. And things changed for the Soviet Union and its image. In our understanding, the Soviet Union remained a dictatorship of socialism. That is why in Germany, in the late 1950s, there were 2 events. The publication of Dr. Zhivago. It was published in German in, I believe, 1958. And I read it with great enthusiasm. And I said to my parents, if I'm going to have a daughter, I want to call her after the character of this book. So on the one hand, I criticized the Soviet Union and its structures, but on the other hand, I included myself into this field of Soviet literature, Russian literature. And a great role in this development was a German journalist, Klaus Werner, who published at the end of the 1950s his book, The Soviet Person. It was thanks to this book that we discovered that the Soviet Union is full not only of Soviets and the Bolsheviks, but of people. And Klaus Werner changed our attitudes. A bit later, when I was a student at Tübingen, I was able to invite to the university Evgeny Yevtushenko, together with Bella Ahmadulina. The German journal Die Zeit invited them. And of course, this is apart from the topic of our discussion today, but I was pleased to be able to invite them to Tübingen. It was amazing because back then, 10,000 students were at Tübingen, but when Yevtushenko made his presentation, there were about 5,000 students present at that event. This demonstrates what a great event this was and how great the interest towards this topic was back at that time. We realized that the Soviet Union was much more than just the Politburo. This development continued at the beginning of the 1960s. The small novel of Solzhenitsyn, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, was published in the Soviet Union and in Germany, of course. Thus, we realized that the political system, which we previously had understood as a monolith, is not, in fact, a monolith. In the middle of the 1960s, the situation changed a little bit. On the one hand, the policy of de-Stalinization, I don't want to say it ended, but it was limited. Simultaneously, in Soviet literature, there were writers, authors who continued on their path. So when I came to the Soviet Union for the first time in 1965, in 1966, there was the Sinyavsky-Daniel trial. That was the year. And when I was in the Soviet Union, I realized over the next few years that there is a new movement emerging in the Soviet Union. I must say that when I look at Germany, West Germany in particular, That was the time of the student movement. Everyone was protesting against the United States, against the war in Vietnam. At the same time, the Prague Spring happened. And there was a lot of tension. On the one hand, there was a protest against the American war. On the other hand, a lot of sympathizing for the changes within Soviet-led Europe, the Soviet bloc. However, in 1968, now the year 1968 was marked not only by the protests against the American wars and the war in Vietnam, simultaneously, this was the year and Andrei Sakharov published his memorandum, where he talked about a peaceful development. And he was making an attempt at finding a convergence between our different systems and our different countries. And one German journal also published the first edition of the Chronicle of Current Events. The human rights movement in the Soviet Union finally had a face, finally had their first presentations. Could I ask about the Chronicle of Current Events? Was that 1968? Was it published in 1968 in Germany? Because Peter Redway writes in his recollections he believes it was Pavel Litvinov. He was sent a parcel to London through somebody. And this was noticed in Germany immediately, is that right? Yes.
Yes.
Пражская весна, но все-таки потом советские войска закончили эту попытку социализма с человеческим лицом.
So we remember there was Prague Spring, but then the Soviet army ended this attempt to build socialism with human face. And the danger emerged that the Soviet Union wasn't capable and wasn't willing to change itself and would continue the policy of dictatorship and repressions. And I remember the state of this tension because on one hand we protested against this United States of America, on the other side we fought for the Prague Spring, and so we protested against the Soviet intervention. It created the need to shape and formulate new policy within Germany. You all know that in 1969, Willy Brandt became the Chancellor of Germany, and his politics started with the policy of de-escalation. And it's a huge contradiction when you organize and conduct negotiations with the Soviet Union in the times when the Soviet Union wasn't allowing for alternative paths of development for their own country. So through those tensions and contradictions, I realized I could comprehend the policies of Willy Brandt as one of the opportunities and chances to change the Soviet Union from within. through the multiplication of our contacts, through the multiplication and amplification of the dialogue. We had the hope that this would be possible. It would be possible to change the political system through trade. Today we know that this was not possible, but I must say that throughout those years, I could understand that policy, and I supported it as an attempt to open the Soviet system, open up the Soviet system, not just within the Soviet Union, but in other countries of the Eastern Europe. So in the times when new human rights defenders emerged in the Soviet Union, I was then convinced I was trying hard to combine my identification with those human rights defenders and with the policy of de-escalation. Sometime later, I had the opportunity to discuss this with our Chancellor, Willy Brandt, and my impression was that his vision was very similar, independently from how today his policy is assessed and interpreted. Critical interpretation. Critical interpretation of his vision and his political philosophy. Maybe you have some other questions, so maybe I went too far away. So several days after Willy Brandt's kneeling in December 1917 in Warsaw, Bill writes to Kobylev in Moscow that this is our only hope, that is our main hope, Willy Brandt. So this hope for being intermediary through culture was expressed by Bill several times. Since 1962, they were in correspondence, and on several occasions, Bill wrote to Kobylev that he apologizes for being too political, for doing something that is too political. So he apologized for getting distracted from literature. Can you elaborate on this? Can you share your views on this? What was the feeling, and what was the role of those cultural intermediaries? The intermediary role of philologists and historians, how to build the connections with that Soviet Union when it just had a military intervention in Czechoslovakia. A small step before that, in 1977, I received, it's when I already worked at the University of Bremen, and my mayor of my town called me and shared with me that he had a conversation with our former chancellor, Willy Brandt, and Willy Brandt told our mayor of Bremen that in his impression in Eastern Europe, that the things that are developing in Eastern Europe, things are brewing in Eastern Europe, something that we as politicians are not comprehending. Things that happen in the Eastern European societies, not just Soviet Union, but in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, in all the countries of the Soviet bloc, of the Communist bloc. And so and that it makes sense to organize an institute or some kind of research center in order to be able to collect the documents about these developments in the Eastern European societies, not in the political, not the political bureaus or political offices and political leaderships of those countries, but within the societies. So my mayor asked me, "Are you ready to create this institute?" And I agreed. My idea, and I'm not sure whether it's funny, weird, or ridiculous, but you're talking about societies. I keep hearing about this distinction between the political sphere and the society. I hear it from the people who work in the former concentration camps, museums, or memorials, that you have to separate the political from society as a completely different subject. Can we say that this idea of Brandt was related with the processing of past in Germany, that society has a different subject on its own, separate from the political level? Of course, of course. To understand this development, you need to understand that in the early 1970s there were different researches made and different publications. First of all, research by Cornelia Gerstenmaier. I think that was the first book in Germany that focused on the and on the early dissident times. It's not just the first book in Germany, says Olga. It's the first research on dissident movement. That's the voice of the deaf, of the speechless. Sorry. It's not the voice of the mute. Yeah, and it's not the only books. There were other authors of the book. One of the authors was Boris Levitsky, born in Kiev. He published two books about the human rights defender movement and the development of other diverse political clubs and organizations within the Soviet Union. When I read those books, I realized that these are minorities and they are unable to have a huge impact on the Soviet society, but the very fact of their existence and was important for me. And they were given prominence and visibility, not just in the Soviet Union, but in other countries of of Eastern Europe. There were new voices emerging. And after the Helsinki conference in mid 70s, first in Soviet Union, but then in other countries of Eastern Europe, clubs and organizations came into existence that promoted human rights within their countries, demanded human rights in their countries, and demanded not revolutions, but a dialogue. For example, Adam Michnik, the most prominent Polish political philosopher of those times, he once wrote that when he wrote his strategy, it was a strategy of evolution and not revolution. We must become so strong that our government would be forced to talk to us. But we have to remain so weak that the Soviet Union doesn't send its army against us. And that's how similar things were happening in Czechoslovakia, in Prague. The Charter 77 was created, and other groups that demanded within their own countries, they demanded political and cultural dialogue with their own dictators. That was extremely interesting for me to observe. I was in Prague back then, and I almost got involved in that movement. I wanted to learn Czech, but it didn't happen, unfortunately, because the Czech organs arrested me for one day and expelled, and I was sent out of Czechoslovakia. So my plan wasn't destined to come true. But we have to remember and have to understand that in Eastern Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe, there was a completely new political understanding and vision happening, and not just about themselves, but the whole European situation. So I understand so I also understood the messages sent to us, to the West. It was not just their own discussion within the country, but messages extended to us. And that's where the idea of the Bremen's mayor came into being that I mentioned earlier. What was on the way for that center? Were there any barriers for this Eastern European Studies Center? How many years did you need? How many years did it take to organize it? I was very happy that very early I managed to enroll Karl Hammerheimer. So there were some researchers within the Western Germany who supported this idea. From the very beginning, we needed to make sure that we had to realize from the start that there are counter arguments for such an institute and archive. And so some scholars in Germany, and not only Germany, but England and France, for example, Efim Etkind and Leszek Kolakowski, and one of the central figures in Germany, Lev Kopylov, who initially, he was in the early 80s, he was exiled into Germany because he visited Henrik Böll, and the Soviet government withdrew his and his wife's citizenship. So he lived in Germany. In Germany, this was a huge event because I don't know anyone, neither from East, but also from the wider Europe, from West, who was so strongly and consequently and consistently had an impact on the society in Germany and German politics. He also supported the idea of creating this archive and the institute. But small anecdote. The mayor of Bremen in the second half of 1980, he visited Bonn and talked to his colleagues and his friends in the leadership of the Social Democratic Party. with Herbert Bayer, and they spoke out very harshly against the creation of the institute. In the international field, in the late 70s, early 80s, there were new international conflicts, and some researchers spoke of the new war, the Afghanistan war, conflict around Poland. The issue of arms in the Soviet Union or in the West. So there were tensions in international relations. So Herbert Wiener and the others spoke out against the creation of this institute, because if we, within one official institute, are dealing with the issues of human rights defenders and opposition in Eastern Europe, this might be a factor for the international relations against the possible agreements between the governments of the countries. At the same time, he invited me, and told me, "Sorry, Mr. Eichwede, but we can't create this." I was outraged, of course, and spoke to Richard Ribbenthal in Berlin, who also was a member of the Social Democratic Party, one of the most known political scholars in Germany of those times. He listened to me sharing the story, and he told me, we were in a restaurant, and he told me, he told me, "I have, dear colleague, I have an unpleasant and discreet question." It was Egon Bahr. Then he asked, so he said, "Are you a member of the Socialist Democratic Party?" I said, "No." And then this 80-year-old scholar stood up. He extended his hand and said, "I will overturn this decision. I'm ashamed that my party spoke up against it."
1 week later, I got a note from my Bremen Bürgermeister, and he said, "This morning I had a very difficult phone conversation. I was really told off. I was told, Hans, you obviously have not read the German Constitution. No one from the Social Democratic Party can ban you from creating this institute. It is your decision alone. It is a matter of autonomy, of our families, of science, of research, and so on, of academia." This was a very harsh conversation, but at the same time, Hans Kroschnik agreed to do this, and Löwenthal said it was all right. He said, "I'm going to pass the phone to Willy Brandt." And Willy Brandt said to my Bürgermeister, "Hans, you must create this institute." But this was contrary to the policy of détente. I'm sorry, Wolfgang. So the creation of this institute was against the policy of détente, and yet Brandt supported something that went against the policy of his party. Is that right? Hans Kroschnik told me this. I asked him twice because I knew that Egon Bahr and Willy Brandt were following a single policy, but then I realized that there's a huge difference. And all of our politicians realized that there have always been some disagreements between our parties, and yet it is a true story. In this way, the city of Bremen made this project a reality. And we were finally able to create this research center. It's not just a research center for East European studies, but it's a research center for independent thinking in Eastern Europe. That would be a more precise name for this institution. I might keep on asking you about how this independent thinking took place in your institute, what you collected, what conferences you conducted, but I suppose I'm just going to invite people to ask questions now before we shift our conversation to the institute itself. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, please do. Alexander. Wolfgang, it's a pleasure to see you. I'm not quite clear. You mentioned Karl. Professor Ivan Macher, what was his position in this conversation around the creation of the institute? Well, because he's part of this conversation, I think he can answer this question himself. I did know that he was doing some work in the same direction. He was doing work around the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. I already mentioned Löwenthal, whom I had also discussed this issue with. Not only with Kopelev, but also with Dittigaya, who was my teacher in Tübingen, and other historians as well. And although this was in parallel, we were doing more in-depth research into the Soviet reality and Soviet society of that time. Perhaps Karl Eichwede could say something now himself? And there he is. Of course, we did have some intersecting interests in our research, something that was termed independent thinking. There were various structures within the Soviet Union. They were known to us, they made sense to us, and I wanted to know more about the diversity of these groups, of these phenomena, especially in the realm of culture, and that's where our interests overlapped. I was included in the institute because the financing of the Bremen University was difficult to get. and Hamburg and Westphalen all were part of this process. So this was a collaboration of various institutions, and so I was included in this institution almost by chance, but it was a real godsend because of our overlapping interests. I was able to be included in the institute that was later named after Lotman. It was dedicated to Soviet and Russian culture in the 20th century. So we worked closely together already. We were friends. Thank you very much. There's a question in the chat. Did the position of the American allies affect the position of Willy Brandt? I do not know whether American policy and politics had an influence or not. What matters is the independence of this approach. If we look at the bigger picture of this time, of this age, we have to take several other aspects into account as well. Let's say my university in Bremen, in the 1980s and the 1970s as well, it was a university. It was like a leftist university among German universities. There were quite a few colleagues working at the university who were defending not only socialism in general, but the Soviet Union in particular. That's why the creation of this institute, of my institute, also gave rise to other questions, like how do we organize the independence of this institute, not only within German politics, but also within the University of Bremen. We were able to do that. We found a legal structure which allowed us and guaranteed us, to this day, independence. Independence from the institute, from political influence, and from other political structures. In that sense, the fact we were really helped by the fact that people from the Soviet emigration, like Etkind and Lev Kopelev, they supported the institute. There was support from other countries in Eastern Europe. In that way, these various legal structures, with the financing of the Volkswagen Fund, we were able to create the institute. Not only that institute, but we were also able to start an archive of samizdat. It was incredibly interesting and challenging. Ever since its foundation in 1982. In 1985, I was excluded from Prague. I was still able to visit Prague in 1982 when the German embassy really helped me. They helped me transport all of those things, all of that samizdat, those publications. I had an agreement with the cultural attaché of our embassy, and we had matching bags. Inside my bag was samizdat. Inside her bag was nothing. But by accident, when, as she was leaving, she took my bag and I took her bag. As a result, these samizdat publications came to be in the embassy. They found their way into Bremen. Another example. Another example is our Polish colleagues. We found in the city of Gdańsk, we found a couple. And we paid for them to travel by boat from Gdańsk to another city, and we gave them some suitcases. Within those suitcases was some samizdat of the Polish human rights movement, Solidarity. So during that boat ride, they were sitting on these suitcases, kissing and showing affection to each other, and no one wanted to interfere with this couple, and they didn't want to check what they had in their suitcase. And this is how this pair of lovers helped us get these samizdat publications to London and then into Bremen. And then a final example is when I was in Budapest. I was on the train. And on the way, I noticed the toilets. And I saw that it was possible to put something in the toilet just behind like a wall. And that's exactly what I did. Every single toilet on that train contained samizdat that was traveling to Vienna. These were little risky adventures, but research and science is not only science. You need some imagination. Of course, the immigration authorities really helped us. Again, Lev Korpilev, he also used some of his contacts to enable this transportation, so some contacts in the Soviet Union. But today in Russia, the situation is different. But back then, in Leningrad, when I visited, I really wanted to visit Nina Maslova. Unfortunately, she didn't pick up the phone, so I couldn't get a hold of her. But then I gave a call to her father. He was a close friend of Lev Korpilev. He invited me over. And when I came to his apartment, he said, you know, Wolfgang, I'm an old man. And, you know, I'm not interested enough, so I've invited my daughter to meet with us. And he called her Mula. And that's how I met all of them at once. And we had a very serious conversation about Poland. About the policy and about the crimes committed during World War II. And just a few minutes later, she told her father, her husband, "You can openly talk to this man. He's all right." And that's how new opportunities came up. New opportunities to gain new material. But maybe the most interesting thing, an interesting meeting was also in Leningrad. By accident, I met at the Mayakovsky Theater some people from East Germany. We spoke German together. And they said that they have very close friends from Leningrad. They want to ask questions about the West, but these Germans were not able to answer because they were from East Germany. So they asked me to talk to them. I wasn't sure what to do because I have some dissident contacts. So I wasn't sure what these people were.
And we agreed that they will call me in a few days, and if they say we're going to the cinema, then I should visit their friends. They called me and said they were going to see a movie, and that has allowed me to see their friends. And just by chance, through this, I met Mark Botvinnik. And Mark Naumovich Botvinnik, his first question, he said, "I don't know almost anyone in West Germany. Just one person who used to live in Leningrad some time ago. Today he lives in Munich. It's Sergei." And I continued, "Pirogov." And another friend, he now lives in Copenhagen. His name is Boris. And I continued, "Weil." And he was in his knees and his feet and shouting. And that made us very close friends. His daughters Noemi and Natalia also became close friends. And since early 90s, I helped them a little bit. And that's when Noemi gave me a huge archive of hers. And that was the beginning of the Russian language part of the Bremen's Center. What changed in 1995 when you risked to invite a new archivist? That was a bold move. What changed? What were the new entries for the archive? How did you work on the archive and performed it? In 95, you had a new archivist, Gabriel Sorfin. In 95, it was a new person. I found him in Munich. I found Gary Superfin. And I involved him in the Bremen archive. And since then, the Russian language part, the Soviet part of our archive, grew significantly. Of course, we had some things from before, from Poland, from Czechoslovakia and Hungary. But with the help of Gary, our Russian language archive grew very rapidly. There are some people here who know Gary, who know how capable he is. He might be difficult sometimes, but as an archivist, he did he did a great job. Can you say what changed? Can I say? I think before 95, he used to have more Leningrad materials. Maybe your geography expanded in 95? We had relatively large material collected from the Soviet Union because during Perestroika, I lived for almost a year in Moscow. And almost every week I visited the embassy and gave them materials, not just samizdat, but also the informal materials, informal circles materials. Today, I'm afraid that the German embassies in other countries are not as cooperative. In using their resources and their, for example, the diplomatic mail. Back then, during Perestroika, the German embassy only asked me to pay for the stamps. And I paid for all of them just to send the materials to Bremen. And in 93, it was 3 or 4 years later, I received approximately 100 Deutsche Marks back, because our ministry wasn't going to use those stamps. So Noemi's archive was the largest private collection we involved in the Bremen Center archive. Then when Gary joined the team, the amount of materials of the archive grew significantly. Question from Olaf Hammond in the chat, and unfortunately he's leaving already, and we haven't had the chance to answer. How did other institutes and scholars studying Soviet Union and other Soviet countries in Western Germany, how they responded to the opening of Bremen's Institute, and how did Bremen's Institute differ from other institutes? The most important thing is that within the institute we organized the archive, and it's not just research institute. It was an institute that still to this day is keeping, I don't know how much, but much more than 100,000 of entries in the archive from the east of Europe. So the creation of this archive required and still required a lot of effort and strength. Those whom I involved as staff members in the Bremen's archive and institute, they not just wrote articles or books, They were first required to gather materials and host and organize channels, some ways to collect those materials. So this combination of the archive and the research aspect of the Bremen Institute, I think it was the most significant characteristic and differing factor for Bremen Institute compared to others. The second thing, which I can observe in other institutions in Germany as well, it's that over the 1980s, until the end of Perestroika, we managed to invite current or past human rights defenders to Bremen, either as staff members of our institute or as guests. We had very close relations with Prague colleagues and friends initially. He was the political secretary in Dubček's times of the Czechoslovak Politburo. He worked for 1 year in Bremen, and same for Prague historians or Hungarians. Taros, known writer and publicist, he worked at the Bremen Institute as well. So as part of our archive work, we at the same time had political connections to human rights defenders and dissidents of Eastern Europe. And that allowed us to gather and collect alternative and differing perspectives. And this is almost my third point now, that some migrants helped us significantly. Larisa Orlova, wife of Kopelev, she didn't want to become an immigrant, but we included her in our institute's work. And she organized, I'm not sure how many, but she organized over 40 interviews with migrants from Soviet Union in Paris, London, New York, Munich. And that allowed us to create new materials of sorts, which raised the significance of the institute. And the fourth point, there was this Garik's work. We started collecting not just samizdat's work, but also the private archives, private collections. Today in Bremen, we have over 500 private collections and archives of people from of immigrants or those who sent us their archive. For example, the archive of Kopelev, the parts of his collection after his forced immigration in Germany, those parts of his materials are at Bremen Institute. That's over 74 boxes.
Это в первую очередь частные архивы, это в первую очередь дела эмигрантов из Советского Союза.
Private collections from the immigrants from the Soviet Union mostly from Soviet Union, but in smaller amounts also from other countries of Eastern Europe. And the last point, we started analyzing and publishing those materials. So we conducted the research work. Yes, can you speak about this in more details? Because you had a series, constantly published series, analytics of the culture, materials, and conferences. And can you elaborate on this? The series that you mentioned only dealt with samizdat issues and things happening in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Dieter Bayrau, and me, we published a big series, large series, studying samizdat questions. One example, a large research project, Alternative Eastern Europe, and fight for autonomy in societies of those times. And as part of this publication, we tried comparing the developments of the Soviet Union with the developments in Poland, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia. We published 4 volumes of this series.
Внутри этого института есть совершенно нормальная научная работа.
And this shows the normal research work that we had in our institutes.
Некоторые люди, которые занимаются с вопросами современной, не только самиздатской, но современных развитий,
those who study and focus on the current developments, they're publishing Länderanalysen, which allows them to study Russia or new countries of Central Asia. But that is beyond samizdat issue.
Это самиздатский мир.
Есть ли какие-то вопросы, потому что...
Do you have any questions?
Уже снова можно, да.
I think it's time.
Пора подключаться, да.
I would like to add a few details, just so it's absolutely clear. The Institute of Bremen it was founded also in the context of the Cold War. And there were different opinions among the Social Democratic Party about whether this should or shouldn't be done. And the money that was used to finance this institute came from different sources. The institute, as the institute, was ideologically independent. So the scholars on the scholarly council created this institute regardless of what the different political movements of the time were. And this is important because against the backdrop of the Cold War, the workers of academia didn't necessarily get a political assignment. They were purely scholars. They were purely in academia. As for the German embassy that helped, so officially, the embassy did not offer any support to the creation of the institute because that would be a political connection. But there were some people in the embassy who realized what was going on, and they personally decided to offer help to the institute. And that's really a really important distinction. This is something I also wanted to mention. It's not only about research in our institute, but also about participation in various conferences. Let's say in 1983, there was a conference that was organized. This was a year after the creation of the institute, or the research center. The aim was to demonstrate that it was possible within the Soviet Union and within other countries to have an alternative political structure. That's where the samizdat came into the picture. Back at the time, we were sure that that was not possible. So the year is 1983. I was professionally convinced that I would meet the Prague Spring in Moscow. During the perestroika, I was in Moscow, and I will attempt to write an article as to why in the Soviet Union back then and in Russia today, why these two countries, why these two entities had very different paths. The other conference was in 1986, that was dedicated to studies of the revolution of 1956 in Hungary and Poland. And in 1990, this was perhaps the most interesting conference, where I invited all of my colleagues with whom I met when I was in Moscow during the perestroika. For instance, Yuri Levada visited Bremen at the time, Lilia Shevtsov, Yan Kim, Bogomolov. These were not only dissidents, but those who were working inside the institutes and the institutions. So I am convinced that to this day, there are people who study the dissident movement within their institutes and within their institutions. Even back in the days of the Soviet Union in 1983, 1984, I was in Moscow. And I was talking to the employees of the Historical University and the worldwide socialist system. And they heavily criticized the structures that they were part of. And then I quoted to them the articles that they themselves had published. And then one of these colleagues showed me a whole bookshelf of manuscripts that they were forbidden to publish. That's how I realized that even within the official institutions, some alternative ways of thinking are possible. And that gave me an insight that has helped me in the development of the research center in Bremen. And so this is where we get to the concept of doublethink. So this idea of alternative culture in Central and Eastern Europe. Today, in some wonderful applications for various grants, I have to talk about how Eichwede talks about the existence of alternative cultures, and then about how there have been writings about the intersection of these cultures. But was there this idea that these cultures are in parallel, that they do not intersect and should not be studied in relation to one another? I believe that the relationship between these different structures, the interaction between the different levels of these structures, is one of the most interesting questions raised. Because so often have I met people who first said one thing, and then 30 minutes later, 2 hours later, they are telling me something completely different. On the one hand, I was sure that that was a sign of hope. And I believe that this experience of doublethink is still alive today. And it allows new dictators to promote their own policies. I believe that doublethink the idea of doublethink is in some sense a positive thing, because there's only two components. We can talk about stereotypes of different levels, or different ways of viewing the same things. The wife of Lev Kopelev, she described Soviet citizens as cynical. She believes that this kind of doublethink allows them not to live in an honest way. Back then, I was sure that within this doublethink was this kind of challenge of an impossibility of doing something, of saying something. But now I see that inside this doublethink, there's also a kind of stabilizing factor that is connected to dictatorship. But of course, it is a central issue. Unfortunately, I have not been to Russia in the past 3 years. So I cannot claim or say whether in today's institutions in Russia, this kind of doublethink, the same kind of doublethink that I experienced some decades ago, is still rife. I don't know if there are still scholars today who are forced to write in a certain way, whereas their research interests lie in a different direction. So I can't say more today, but in the 1980s or in the 70s, there were very different aspects of this doublethink. I suppose a response to this idea of doublethink is the book of Boris Firsov, Разномыслие. I suppose it's the most diverse book of them all. Do you have any questions? Or maybe answers? Good day. The question I have is not so much about your work as a scholar, as a researcher, but as to someone who was part of some historical processes. Are you able to remember your reaction during the perestroika? When the dissidents refused to take part in the official political life, can you recall your attitude back then to these events? So through the prism of a German person. What was your vision of the situation, your attitude back then? Back then, my experience was very different. On the one hand, I already mentioned Nomi Podvinik. She lived in Moscow back then. I visited them a lot, I talked to them, and she was very careful. She was quite skeptical when she studied perestroika. She was sure that this was a development within the existing structure. She was afraid and she was sure that the democratic possibilities of Soviet society were not powerful enough. And when I look at the Yeltsin epoch, he put his policies forward not through democratic processes, but through the nomenclature. So there was some criticism of Soviet structures, but this movement was too weak to realize that potential. That's why, for instance, Noemi looked at the development of perestroika with skepticism.
Уже во время перестройки и потом во время Ельцина и после распада Советского.
Second point, and after perestroika in Yeltsin's time, there were nationalist structures developing within the society. Maybe initially they were not nationalist in nature, but they were imperialistic, and gradually, step by step, the nationalist and imperialistic discourse merged. So quite a few of the dissidents I knew were afraid of the nationalist populism winning within the Soviet structures, even during the perestroika times, and of course later on. And it's not the question of pamit. During the perestroika times, I visited several times the nationalist meetings and gatherings. And I was outraged, I was infuriated, because from the very beginning I was afraid, not just the tone, but and the general direction of what they were speaking of. And once during Perestroika, I spoke to Zhirinovsky, whom our liberal Democrats in German FDP financed back then, because they thought he might be the new independent power, independent from the communist and Marxist structures. On the other hand, one has to mention that there were several former dissidents who got involved in politics. The most well-known example is Sergei Adamovich Kovalov. In Soviet times, he was imprisoned in Gulag, and in the 90s he became a parliament member. And until the mid-90s, he was convinced that Anatoly Chubais was building democratic structures in Russia, and we had very strong debates. We were close friends. We spoke many times in Russia, in Berlin, and Bremen. Larisa Bogoraz, for example, initially she had hopes. Her skepticism was stronger than that of Kovalyov. But she had hoped. Maybe the most interesting and most fantastic example for me is that of Galina Starovoitova, who back in the Soviet times worked within samizdat structures. Then she supported Armenia and Caucasian people's issues. For me, she was one of the highest hopes I had. As you know, she was murdered. It was an event for my own life, important, because she invited me to have a dinner with her in the evening, in one night of in St. Petersburg. And she said, you don't have to keep living in the hotel. You can stay with us. But I had to. But I had to go to Germany. And that night, when she came back home, she was murdered.
Поэтому у меня было впечатление, что большие части бывшего диссидентского
So I had the impression that large parts of former Soviet dissident movement were afraid that the democratic structures in new Russia were not strong enough. And they were quite skeptical. Not all of them. Thank you so much. We are out of time. Maybe we have a very short but very important question. The most important one.
У меня есть вопрос.
Алло, это я хочу еще, поскольку, значит, последний вопрос, Касается фактически меня. Насчет, знаете,
As the last question was closely related to me, but our hopes in the perestroika. We followed closely what was happening in culture, and we understood some things, but it turned out that the perestroika time, we realized we didn't know anything important about the country in reality. So we were very enthusiastic and participating in new projects and initiatives. And after some time, we realized, first of all, that these dissidents, those who had left the country, maybe they were actually more realistic in their vision of the situation and didn't do much, even though they could do much. But we we kind of caught up with their understanding. The mentality of a Soviet citizen was so stable that changing something from within is almost impossible. And that was actually true. So we were naive and hopeful, we're dreaming of we're very hopeful. Maybe there were others sharing this hope, and we shared a language. But in the end, none of us understood that in reality, the 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 personnel was and the apparatus was stronger than what we expected it to be. Can I continue my reflections? Very shortly, because in this particular question, in this very philosophical moment, we actually have a question in the chat if the seminars are being published online. Yes, somewhere in June we'll have this webinar posted at the ZFL chat. Question to Wolfgang: if you remember the different views among the immigrants in relation to Gorbachev. For example, Polish people were very hopeful about him, but but former Soviet dissidents were very skeptical towards Western politics of openness towards Soviet Union. And I think this will be a good final point of our today's conversation. Wolfgang, this is a question to you. Do you remember the difference of views within the immigrant circles in relation to Gorbachev? Yeah, in the chat you have now the link where the webinars will be posted later on. Yes, please. Gorbachev's question is a separate issue. I'm afraid that maybe that's connected to your question. Something I want to say. We in the West, we celebrated in the end of 80s we celebrated this peaceful revolution. I don't remember how many articles I wrote about that this is a new development within the European politics. Maybe in relation to Prague or Warsaw, this was true. But in terms of Soviet Union and Russia, the peacefulness of the changes in Russia had a high price. Old structures, the old apparatus, they survived. Do you understand what I mean? Yes, old structures. They survived the end of the Soviet Union, and they kept and they still keep living within the new Russia. Even today, we already quoted Peter Redway today a couple of times. He's one of the most prominent scholars of the development. 10 years ago, he published this book, Market Bolshevism Against Democracy. So, through the Bolshevism, they managed to implement and realized they attempted at creating new society, but that is not possible. And so, up until today, through the 90s, this continues to be the presence of the old structures with new possibilities, without the ideology, but all new means of repression. Thank you so much. Thank you to Wolfgang, to everyone attending and asking questions. This optimistic topic we will continue on the 21st of June with Karel Enenmacher. And we would be happy to see all of you who feel welcome to come and ask your questions. Thank you so much. Thank you.